everyone. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Awaken Empowered TV. I'm Ethan Fox, and I'm here with Micheila Sheldan. And today we're going to be doing another episode where we're doing some channeled questions to uncover some of the mysteries of our ancient lineage, and also putting that in the context of the modern world and what's going on today, so that we can sort of incorporate some of these ancient teachings and wisdom and actual techniques into our modern society that we live in now. For these channeling shows, I don't discuss with Micheila ahead of time what my questions are, so she can be completely out of the loop as far as I don't want her to have any biases or any thoughts in her mind about anything we're going to be talking about. Of course, she is a trance channel, and because of that, the information that or what she's channeling, her mind doesn't interfere with it. But just to be extra careful and extra sure, I prefer not to discuss these. So these are completely fresh questions that she has not heard. So we're going to get right into it now and move on to this subject. So whenever you're ready. Last time we talked a bit about Tantra and relationships and things like that. And I wanted to delve more deeply into that. And in particular, this time talk a bit about the divine masculine and feminine. But I want to start with a general understanding in the context also of what's taking place in the world today. And then by the end of our conversation, go back around to ancient wisdom and teachings and how we can apply them. So to begin, I want to understand in a modern context how, as far as the ancient teachings would apply today, how would we perceive a divine masculine or a divine feminine person? Like, what are the characteristics, if there are even any? For example, is divine feminine characteristically what we think of as feminine? You know, women who are more nurturing and warm and caring and mothering, and maybe even dress in a more feminine female way as we stereotypically know of it today anyway. And characteristically in our society, women who are more feminine tend to have longer hair, where men don't characteristically have that. So there are certain physical qualities and, of course, hormonal differences as well that we notice today. And men, characteristically, as we know of it today, what we think of as a male man is more masculine, tend to be more physical, maybe more analytical, and more of that strong father figure versus the nurturing feminine side. And men in our society, on the whole, certainly not all, tend to have shorter hair, although I know in native traditions men had longer hair as well. But I'm trying to understand, what does the divine masculine and feminine look like in day-to-day life if we were to apply it and if we were to aspire to those characteristics today?
Well, this is an interesting and multi-layered question, and we are the Pleiadians, and we're so pleased to bring our insights into this discussion, because there are so many ways to look at these ideals of masculine and feminine. Of course, if we are taking this to the highest level, every being is a creator, and as such must contain both the masculine and feminine in some semblance of division. Not necessarily to associate with it as a character or as a soul playing out a story, but in order to fulfill a destiny. Because masculine and feminine energies, they have their origins within the cosmos. And we are speaking here, of course, in terms that are understandable by all of those who are watching, because we know there are varying religious beliefs that must be accounted for when we are referring to the prime creator, which is known as God in some circles. So if we bring this into a more physical manifestation or discussion, as you are requiring of us, we would say that there's a huge difference between the masculine and feminine definition as it is coined in biology, and the masculine and feminine that has evolved through a certain lineage or ancestry. And both must be accounted for and certainly apply, because on every planet, in every star system throughout history, masculine and feminine exist. It simply exists through an evolutionary process and has become something well defined and understood. So, what you are explaining to us in terms of the more feminine and softer qualities, nurturing, for example, and the more masculine and protective qualities of a man, these have become more associated with on Earth than they have been in other star systems. And we can go back to ancient civilizations and say that in native tribes, even, these positions were revered, but for very different reasons than they are today. So let's first take the roles of masculine and feminine, and then we'll speak a bit to the biology and the chemistry and the makeup as you have requested. What we notice about communal gatherings, whether they be tribal in nature or even more cosmic or futuristic, is this: it is natural for beings to take on certain roles that they are predisposed to fulfilling, whether that is nurturing young children or teaching them in some way, or whether it's tending to the earth and building shelter, even hunting and gathering for the tribe. There's a certain makeup that exists within the genetics of humans that predispose them to these activities. And that predisposition, we think, is sometimes looked at and categorized in a very negative way. Yet we think it's such a positive part of who you are and who you've become from the very beginning of time. The seeding of humanity, for example, and all of the multidimensional genetics that you have enhances these roles as they have been playing out throughout time. However, we do note that the masculine and feminine balance and chemistry within each individual has to take on a certain dominance in order to fulfill these roles. And this is why you may notice the difference in structure or in the natural, again, predisposition to love and nurture and to care. It is not exclusive to the feminine or to the masculine, but certainly souls choose these biologic characteristics, in other words, because they somehow suit a part of the plan that they have already orchestrated. Meaning, women may come to the earth and already have chosen a role in mothering. And while that doesn't take away their desire to do other things, that is something that is so important to the evolution of humanity that it's revered from the heavens. But what we've noticed throughout time, and we could go so long and so far into this topic that it could take up the entire period of time that we are spending together, is this: there has been so many different malevolent influences and forces that is affecting this natural evolution that sometimes it's very hard for souls to truly fall into with great ease the choices that they have made. In other words, the homeostasis within a feminine or a masculine being is very easily found if there's no resistance to that choice. But once resistance has been implanted in the mind, or perhaps certain toxins have entered the body, or there's been programming from outside of the self, these very subtle and we might say even profound balances of masculine and feminine become slighted. And this is what you are witnessing right now to a certain degree. Genetics have been such a huge focus on planet Earth for such a very long time. And in fact, we could say this history comes from the cosmos. We revere our genetics in Pleiades, as many other races and star systems revere their own, because genetics, they're everything. There's such a beautiful and delicate interplay between our genetics and everything that we become, either physically or non-physically or both. So for anyone to have access to our genetic template and to somehow attempt to skew it is to weaken our lineage. And this is what we fear has happened. So it isn't necessarily important, we think, that a divine feminine or a divine masculine being has to fall into a very narrow definition or range of what that is. But there are some things that will come natural to them that are so ingrained in these predestined choices that if it is resisted, can take a soul off of its true path.
Okay, so based on that, what you're saying is, and I'm just going to paraphrase from my own words so that you can tell me if I'm on the right track and continue from there. So what you're saying is that our genetic predisposition as masculine or feminine, in divine masculine or feminine, does tend to direct us towards certain activities. And if I'm understanding correctly, so for example, men might be hunters, and women may be the ones who prepare the food in some tribes, in older and more ancient, and maybe even some indigenous tribes today on the planet. And even in Western society until fairly recently, those roles are similar. Maybe prior to the 1970s in the United States, as an example, that was more characteristically true, where women prepared the food and they took care of the children, so they were mostly homemakers, and men typically went away to work. So if I'm understanding correctly, you're saying that our genetic predisposition toward masculine or feminine would lead us into preferences for those types of lifestyles or ways of living or choosing.
We agree. You're clarifying what we have stated well, yet we want to make the topic a bit broader in terms of these roles. And we know you are generalizing here, of course, because for us to say that every divine feminine being comes to nurture children and feed children would be an overarching definition that would not account for many different deviations of this, of course, because some women come not to certainly give birth to children, but are here to birth other things and to become nurturers of the earth and caretakers of the sick. So we can't say in every situation that we can clarify so rigidly, yet we agree with the premise of what you are stating.
Okay, so the premise being the idea of those characteristics, such as you mentioned, nurturing. So it may not be children necessarily, but maybe a woman or a divine feminine woman may decide to be a school teacher or something else of that nature. Whereas, for example, if we reverse the roles, if a divine masculine were to become the nurturing parent or take on a more traditionally female role, is that still divine masculine?
Let's explain this from a different viewpoint, and then we'll answer your question, because we want to talk a little bit more about the makeup as we see it, divine masculine and feminine, how it plays out through a soul structure. And let's speak in terms of of physicality. So every soul that comes to be human has a mind, a body, emotions, as well as a spirit. And while all of these things are accessed and utilized, what we tend to notice is divine masculine our beings are more available to working well within the physical and mental constructs of their energy body. And that isn't wrong necessarily. In fact, a divine masculine being can be an incredible teacher by channeling these important insights and aspects of self and using them as a tool to offer to others. And in the same way, divine feminine, we believe, is more accessible to the emotional body as well as the sensitivities of spirit. And because of this, can certainly be more nurturing and available to those areas, but can become a teacher in this way. So it isn't necessarily the roles, again, that we want to focus on so much as how those roles are addressed differently uh, in terms of these different energies, if that makes sense.
All right. Yeah, I do understand the direction you're going. So essentially, we're going to talk about the roles necessarily, but the way that the individual exercises those roles. So, for example, divine masculine, I think you said was more technical or more, what was it, thought oriented or logical or something like that, right? So, for example, a divine masculine who is a teacher might be, would we say, a physics teacher or an engineering teacher or maybe a shop teacher or something like that?
Possibly, but there are other interests, of course, that a divine masculine being could pursue. But let's put this back into the family unit and the tribe, if you will. A divine masculine being having such incredible access to a mental processing and a physical processing that a divine feminine being doesn't, can utilize those gifts and talents to ensure that the thought process that goes into something is complete, that the physical nature of what must be done is handled. There's a certain, we'll say, reliance on that the divine feminine has that makes her role in accessing what she has available to her easier, in other words, and to apply it even wider. So if a masculine and a feminine being are working together and they're truly working within their strong suits of energy, they're going to complement each other in the most perfect way. And in doing so, complete the whole. So again, we want to take this out of the realm of a teacher having to teach a certain subject because we know that there are certain divine masculine beings who are very adept at art. They are channeling their divine feminine self, which has been rare oftentimes throughout history, and bringing it to the surface in a different way. So they're varying degrees of this that we don't think are necessarily wrong. But when those degrees become far too intensified or far too out of balance, that's where we begin to see, we could say, some inauthenticity going on in the genetics.
So you said divine masculine is more physical. So is that why characteristically in tribal societies as well as in Western societies today, men tend to gravitate toward more physical activities? For example, hunting for food, for example, and why men tend to have a more muscular physiology characteristically. And when you said intellect or something like that, I forget the word that you use exactly, but so we tend to, or divine masculine tends to have more talents in, or they process their environment through those avenues.
Well, we like what you're saying here. The processing is key, but also a soul's energetic signature, let's say, is made up of several things. First, the masculine and feminine balance, and that is going to determine which areas they process through. But in addition to that, there are a variety of opportunities, we might say, for a soul throughout its entire life to explore the masculine or feminine that isn't their true nature. And this we think is just as important as anything else, because in a spiritual sense, what you're noticing on planet Earth is the awakening of the masculine through its more feminine sense. And this isn't necessarily wrong, but if it is chosen as the dominant part of the self, could take a soul off its path.
Okay, so to put that in the context of what's going on in the world today, well, first of all, before we get to that, are there any limitations that the divine masculine has that would limit it in terms of things or ways that it can process its environment or experience that the feminine does very naturally, and vice versa? Does the divine feminine have any limitations beyond which that are more masculine that the masculine can do very easily?
We don't want to use the word limitation, but we'll say there's a threshold where the divine masculine, for example, being more predisposed to the mind and the physical body, is truly able to offer something very unique through those parts of self. And while it can explore its feminine components, and we think that's an amazing thing to do, it would never become fully the feminine being that a true divine feminine soul is. And this is why the biochemistry and all of the sensory outlets in a feminine being work completely differently than that of a masculine. We're not saying here that the sensory system of a masculine being is weaker, but what we are saying is it isn't its first instinct to work with. Because in ancient civilizations, there was a reliance on the grandmothers and the wisdom keepers and the oracles and the matrons who would come in and support the men in the tribe with channeled information, with instincts and intuition. It's not to say that the hunters and gatherers did not also learn that, but they learned it in such a physical way as you could imagine. The hunter and gatherer would begin to feel the senses of the skin, the changes in wind, and the speed that a bypassing animal might be picking up as it senses danger. These are the subtle intricacies where perhaps a more masculine being would be using its body and its outer senses versus a feminine soul using the inner psychic abilities and intuition. So the instincts work a bit differently biologically and biochemically for a purpose. It isn't to say one is better or worse, and they could be adapted in both masculine and feminine to a certain level. But our question is, why would you choose to do this when you have come with such an ingrained strength to work with? To try to change that ingrained strength or to work against it is why we see so many on planet Earth suffering today.
All right. Well, on that topic, as I mentioned earlier, prior to the 1970s in the United States, and I don't know if this is true globally, but actually it's not true in all areas exactly the same timing. But we'll use this as a conversation topic. But prior to the 1970s, we had more female-male roles in society that were much more defined than they are today. But since then, with the, for example, in the 1970s, the women's liberation movement, and we've come now to modern times where currently we have a trans movement, non-binary, LGBTQ, etc. All those further steps in a direction where the lines between male and female are becoming blurred. Is there a particular is that a good thing that we're exploring those experiences, or is that taking us farther away from? I mean, for example, you were saying sometimes it's okay for divine masculine to explore some feminine qualities, but beyond a certain point, it becomes detrimental. Have we reached that point, or is all of what's taking place in the planet today an essential part of that journey to becoming more perfect divine masculine and feminine beings?
Well, in our viewpoint, everything has its purpose, meaning there will be times on any planet and within any race where extremes are gone to in order to explore things like masculine and feminine and how they have been defined throughout history, such that they can evolve and become something better. But there's always an underlying factor that we must account for. And this is focused solely on planet Earth because we know this is where you reside and what you are most interested in. There have been so many malevolent influences throughout history that have been focused on eroding your genetics, that many of the patterns and the belief systems and the implants that are coming to the planet today in terms of certain storylines and characters that humans must adopt are very outside of the realm of your true blueprint or divine plan. So we want to go back perhaps to something that we've stated previously and often in these discussions. There are always going to be periods where the pendulum will swing to one side. And that is because it has been on the other side for so long that a race wants to explore the difference in what it has been living. Contrast abounds, and that contrast gives us not only something to navigate our personal reality, but also a premise for evolution. But never have we seen such extremity having stayed in for such a long period of time. And this could only be because there are hierarchical forces at work, or we might say from a numbers standpoint or a population perspective. This many people choosing to not associate with a certain gender. And we don't believe it's wrong, again, necessarily. We think everything can be extremely helpful and purposeful in self-realization and a soul becoming something that it is meant to always become. So we might add that there are souls right now on planet Earth who are predestined to experience exactly what you are asking us about, even though it seems outside of what you might expect for a human race. And that is taking humanity in a specific direction. Even in families, some of these souls have been born to parents and entire lineages to show up and challenge certain ideals. Now, you mentioned to us the 1970s and feminism movements and things like this. And when we speak of malevolent force and we speak of programming, this is exactly what we are talking about. It is not to say that a divine feminine soul choosing to live in a certain way beyond what it has been taught is wrong. But to train an entire population in the rhetoric that we have observed is not natural. And we think it's taken way too many souls off their path beyond what they are meant to experience.
Now, the movement in the 1970s, feminism was orchestrated behind the scenes by the US CIA organization. So it seems like, so what you're referring to is that there are these different institutions or hierarchical structures in our society today in the world who are essentially orchestrating these movements and bringing them to an extreme and holding them to that extreme longer than it should be.
And we can use a brilliant analogy here that we think many would understand. When you are planting a seed, as long as that seed is pure and organic and receives the natural resource that it needs, it will grow to be whatever it is meant to be, and it will serve many people. But on the planet today, many of your seeds have been changed genetically. And those genetic seeds are in very sterile environments, and they are receiving the same thing to become exactly what someone wants it to be. And this is what we see happening in humans, unfortunately. If a seed is left to itself and in a natural and organic environment, blossoms to prefer to become more heavily focused in masculine and feminine, then it is most likely on track of its divine plan. But if a program or an inorganic structure has been changed or placed within that seed, we might say, it's going to blossom to become something that it was never meant to be, something that might be exactly the same as everything else. And this is the concern, we'll say, that we have when you're mentioning organizations like this and some of their messaging. It is like planting something in the seed of the mind that blossoms a soul away from its true path.
So today we have a lot of messaging that's going around to what appears to be to feminize the masculine more. For example, a lot of messaging to not eat meat anymore, which typically men tend to like to eat meat. And also, for example, like testosterone is being called a poison these days. So, although I realize that testosterone isn't what makes man man or divine masculine masculine, but these messaging, these different kinds of messages are starting to become very dominant in society today. Is that all part of that same taking us off track to go to one extreme?
What you must uncover is the foundational purpose behind all of these messages and the actions that are also accompanying them. And with great respect for those who might hear this and feel a sense of fear, it is never our intention to highlight something that would cause harm to a soul's vibration. Yet, we would be remiss if we were not to acknowledge that there is a group of hybrid humans on planet Earth with a malevolent focus to both change the human genetic to weaken the potential of humans to make certain decisions or to be in power or a sense of sovereignty, and also to lower the population to a degree where it is more manageable to control. These two foundational reasons will be seen or can be uncovered in every one of the agendas that we see playing out on planet Earth today.
So what you're saying is the all these different messages and also the various movements toward feminizing men and making women more masculine are to disempower society and make them weaker, more easy to control.
Well, there is an energetic standpoint to this that must also be understood. We've talked a great deal here about the chemistry and the biology, but From an energetic standpoint, masculine and feminine, these energies are not just creative in nature, they are restorative and they are strengthening. They can also be healing. So if a divine masculine being believes that it must focus only in feminine and a feminine being must focus only in masculine, they are working with somewhat a weaker component of their own energy field. And in doing so, is not able to show up and provide this energetic exchange that we speak of.
You mentioned that if a being or a human or soul comes into a physical body with a certain structure, there are certain tendencies that you naturally will be drawn toward in life. So, is it reasonable to assume then that if these different interferences had not occurred in our society, that human beings who were born into a female body would always, or at least most of the time, gravitate toward more of the divine feminine characteristics that we already discussed, for example, intuition and feeling and emotion, versus someone born into a male body would almost always, if not always, gravitate toward more physical and characteristics that you mentioned that are attributable to divine masculine.
Well, there are deviations of this. So we hesitate to use the word always because we know, of course, that souls come to have multiple and infinite experiences, not only of their genetics and divine masculine and feminine energies, but also certain talents and abilities that don't preclude a soul based upon gender. And we'll give you an example. There have been time periods where the feminine masters have been the leaders of the tribe. They have been the wisdom keepers. They have been the ones who have gone out and roamed the lands and built the temples. Now, in these circumstances and in these civilizations, it was because it was meant to happen that way. There was not the balance of masculine necessary for the feminine to rely on. So there was a reliance upon themselves. Now, we don't see that necessarily being the case in this day and age. But we do know there are a variety of souls coming to planet Earth right now who are living out predestined plans to explore the, we'll say, the alternate and perhaps unseen part of their energetic signature, which in a masculine being might be feminine and in a feminine being might be masculine. We don't see this as a problem. What we do see as a problem is the influence of society to do this as the right way. And that's what we're noticing about the time space reality you are in, is that this influence is creating an unnatural type of evolutionary process that is guided in the direction of a very slight number of souls and what they want for the planet.
So, obviously, we're all having our human journey at this point, and although, as we discussed earlier, some of this has been taken off track a little bit by the hierarchical structures in the world today. Nonetheless, we're evolving through these experiences, even though it is an extreme. And at some point, it will come back to middle or to a more neutral place, I imagine, with the wisdom and experience we gain from going to such an extreme. From your perspective, can you even foresee whether or not we're going to remain in this extreme for the foreseeable future, or are we near the end of that extreme and going to return back to neutral?
We always see multiple possibilities, but we evaluate those possibilities based upon a certain match to your vibration as a whole. And there are some good signs that we would like to share. First, we are noticing a great number of humans awakening to what we have just spoken of, this foundational agenda, and those that are behind it. And because of this, they are becoming, we'll say, internally rewired, and consciously awakened to the idea of living more authentically and outside of some of the false timelines and pathways they have been on for a great number of years, even beyond the generations that are embodied on planet Earth today. However, the extremity that is taking place on planet Earth isn't necessarily something that we think is going to change right away. And in extremity or intensity, chaos even can be a very positive thing, even though we know in human bodies it does not feel this way. And this is why. When there is intensity, when there is chaos, you can guarantee there is a new design coming into being. And we are not sure exactly what that new design will look like because all of you are deciding together. But we do see the fate of those who are working behind the scenes. So imagine that a collective comes together with a single intent, and that intent is malevolent and perhaps focused on weakening human genetics. And all of those humans have a common time or criteria through which they are meant to focus their will. This happens all of the time in everyday life, but many of you do not recognize this. Humans will come together to create something. And that creation may be a corporation, a business, and the business falls apart. And there are many fingers pointed and a lot of discussion about what went wrong, when in fact, it was a soul timing that brought these people together. They were meant to build something and walk away at the exact time it would deconstruct to give them a different experience, and all of those involved in what they've created something new as well. And so we can say wholeheartedly that all of those who gather with malevolent intent have an expiration date. Not to say that it will be a stark change right away. But what you may notice is a waning or a weakening in their influence. And this is already starting, even though they may still be creating chaos and intensity. The way that humans respond to that is going to be the key. Meaning, if humanity falls into the chaos and becomes falls victim to it, we might see a revival of some of the activities that have been taking place for the last couple of years. And we know this has already been discussed, that there may be future accounts of what you've just gone through. That is never a guarantee, even though from a more cosmic or even astrological standpoint, there are influences that will come in that may be challenging. Nothing is ever set in stone. You are all co-creating it together.
I'd like to spend a little time talking about how we get back to a more divine feminine, divine masculine state, but we'll get to this spiritual component of it later, spiritual practices and things of that nature. I want to first talk more about the more physical components of it, or if there are any. For example, regardless of where we may be as a male or female human being, let's start with female, for example. How does that individual know if they're operating in an optimal divine feminine state in a purely physical sense, not the spiritual part? We'll address that later. But for example, are there certain interests or not interests, but directions or things that they should pursue in life to develop those qualities, perhaps even career interests or lifestyle choices, or are there any physical components at all, or is that not at all important?
There is no outer measurement of a divine feminine soul's ability to harness that energy to its fullest. The only measurement could be contentment internally and a connection, we believe, with other humans in that soul's life in a way that is soothing and nurturing. Because ultimately, this is how we see divine feminine souls. They are healers and they are teachers and they are nurturers. And if that piece is missing, even internally of the self, or even especially, we might say, internally of the self, that should be a red flag that there is something going against the grain in terms of your ability to properly channel that energy. So we can't say that showing up in any specific role is so important, other than the way that a divine feminine soul feels within themselves. And that is often something that we think is minimized right now on planet Earth. And we'll give you an example of what we are speaking of. So many humans today are struggling with depression, for example, or stress or anxiety. And many of these have been diagnosed with certain illnesses, mental illnesses or diseases. This is a sign that ultimately you are going against the grain of your natural sense of energy. Because if you are feeling anxiety and somehow predisposed to the outer world controlling your inner, you are holding back on a natural essence that is your birthright and able to be channeled and utilized. And we know we are saying this in very easy terms. It may seem that we are speaking down to those who have these diseases, and they should be able to easily understand and put into application what we are saying. But what we're demonstrating here is how far away human souls have been directed from their true and authentic self. So if you are living within the true balance of your feminine or masculine energy, you will feel content, you will feel strong, you will have energy to do the things that you need to do, and you'll naturally follow instinctively where you are meant to go and also what you are meant to do.
Okay, so if we're talking about divine feminine right now, if somebody is born into a female genetic structure or female genetic body, let's say, it doesn't really matter what career choices or things of that nature that they pursue, but it's more about focusing on the qualities of divine feminine, such as the emotional quality or intuition or nurturing. So if you are in a female physiology right now, and you have no interest in those things, or if you have not developed those qualities, are those necessary?
Well, let's back up for a minute and let's give another example that we think would be very valuable here. Because you've brought up the feminist movement and the divine feminine souls on planet Earth feeling as if they have to take a more masculine role in a workplace. We don't see anything wrong with a feminine being choosing a more business environment. In fact, we think that it's been important over the last several years for the divine feminine to inject itself into primarily masculine energies. And this is why. Sometimes there is service here. Sometimes feminine souls are entering a more masculine dominated energy to break up patterns and to change the consciousness of those entities. Even business, for example, is becoming more spiritually aware and more conscious as you move into the fifth dimension. But again, the problem here that we see is that there has been an overall message, a resounding message to the whole of humanity that feminine beings are unworthy unless they are taking a position of work in a masculine way. And this is where you may find the perfect example of what we have just explained, where someone is feeling the stress and the anxiety and the unnatural state of being by choosing to do something that they were never meant to do in the first place. So on the whole, we see the divine feminine possibly choosing roles that are more nurturing and healing in nature, but not necessarily exclusive of certain more masculine traditional experiences, if that makes sense.
Well, I'd like to go back to ancient times to maybe add a bit more color to what we're discussing and maybe get more understanding. For example, Nefertiti held a very leadership oriented role in her time, in her during her rulership, which typically was a male role, and throughout dynastic and pre-dynastic Egypt, there were primarily male leaders, but every once in a while there was a female leader. And so she was one of those exceptions. Did she live or lead in a more masculine way or a more divine feminine way?
Nefertiti led through her heart. And this is quite different than how a masculine soul would ever lead. We have discussed masculine and feminine in terms of the mind, body, emotions, and spirit. But let's shift now to the frequency of the heart, because the divine feminine has come up in such a way throughout ancient history to revere and even practice the connection to the heart. So in ancient civilizations like Egypt, for example, the heart resonance between divine feminine leaders and their entire populations were strong. Messages were brought in through the heart, and the intuition was read through a feminine soul like Nefertiti, taking on a more or masculine characteristic, but able to utilize those things in proper balance. So certainly there are times when we notice a divine feminine master will take a lead role and have a very compassionate and adept use of their physical and mental structures, but through a more compassionate and resonant energy of the heart. And this is something that we believe has been most lost on the earth plane today, especially in the divine masculine, perhaps even trained out of the masculine purposely through time. So imagine in today's world, a divine feminine master coming in with profound access to the higher mind and to the physical body, and able to channel that through the resonance of the heart in a very collective way. You would see a much different society than you live in now, one that is less hierarchical and perhaps more abundant and more prosperous in nature.
So is living through the heart a uniquely divine feminine characteristic?
It does not have to be, but we do notice that here on Earth, especially in more ancient civilizations, the divine feminine masters have dominated in this area. And even still today, it is the reason why the transition on Earth to awakening and higher consciousness has been led through the feminine, because it is that resonance of the heart, a very detectable energy indeed, that can be channeled and utilized as a benefit in the feminine structure. So the divine masculine, perhaps in this timeline that you are on, they are catching up to where a lineage of feminine beings throughout space and time have had access to this very valuable technology, even we'll call it, and some today even coming back and reincarnating without having to reactivate it again.
So, based on that, is it a role of the divine feminine on the planet today to lead us into a spiritual or more highly conscious future, whereas that may not be a male or a divine masculine role?
In this timeline, yes, we agree with you, but not in everyone. It is not exclusive, in other words, to the choice of masculine and feminine. Ultimately, to live in unity consciousness, masculine and feminine must be in perfect balance. And what that means is there aren't necessarily certain roles that must be characteristic of each gender, but there is a merging together of the strengths and talents, as we've mentioned, and energies of all humans together as one. And this is how the ancients practiced. They were upholding each other in their energy and ensuring that that energy was properly exchanged to benefit the whole civilization.
So, in an ideal scenario, an individual, whether physiologically male or female, would have a little bit of both divine feminine and masculine in them.
Yes,
Okay.
that is
But,
correct.
but would it be biased one way or another based on the physiology? Meaning, would a person with a male physiology be more masculine and maybe a little feminine, and female physiology be the opposite?
Yes, and that is what we have been referring to all along. There's a threshold, in other words, and certainly someone who chooses a more masculine role as a soul is going to have more availability to those masculine energies because they are meant to put them into some very beneficial use, and vice versa. And this is why masculine and feminine work so well together, because what is not in its highest quantity within another can be met and replenished as souls come together and merge.
Okay, let's talk about Nefertiti's counterpart, Akhenaten. He was also a leader and was a highly revered leader, but also highly revered for having a very specific and counter to the society at the time spiritual belief system that seemed to be a more conscious belief system than what was present at the time. So here's an individual who was a masculine physiology, although based on his depictions, he might not have been entirely Homo sapien sapien as we know human beings to be today. He might have been a hybrid or an extraterrestrial or something, but still there seems to be some male physiology there from the depictions we see, different from Nefertiti, who looks very female. How did he lead differently than Nefertiti?
If we are to answer this question, we are to open up the vaults of knowledge that refer to tantric practice, because the leaders that were successful in relationship like this were using these practices to take up the balance of energy from each other necessary to exist in a higher state of those energies. In other words, perhaps we could say the masculine today is defaulting to a lower frequency range of the physical and mental embodiment that they are capable of. Because if consciousness or enlightenment was truly present, these things would not be used to destruct, they would not be used to demean, they would not be used to traumatize, which was not the case with the ancients you are speaking of. A more enlightened state of consciousness doesn't neglect the masculinity within itself, but transforms it through the balance of the feminine to become something of higher consciousness. And in this way, expresses through itself to change the entire collective it is guiding. We realize that you have referred to these two souls as leaders. And we want to make the distinction between the leaders that you have brought to certain positions of power on planet Earth today, and those that existed in ancient civilizations like the one you refer to, they were not leading as of being in power over others. They were guiding and mentoring and providing insights such that everyone would thrive. But to do this, they had to first understand how to thrive themselves. So many of these ancient rulers, leaders, guides, they were taught by ancient masters, even intergalactic beings, on how to use certain practices of breath to raise the energy from the lower chakras into the higher and to exchange it between the masculine and feminine, such that the more beautiful aspects, the more sentient aspects of these parts of self were not only strengthened, but the entire physicality and nature of those souls would completely change. And this is why you see them in the most ornate and beautiful states that you do in ancient renderings, because they were literally becoming a blended genetic aspect of each other.
Now, were Akhenaten and Nefertiti human beings as we know of today, the same species, or were they an entirely different race
Certainly
or
not the
species?
same species that you are today. And the reason that we say this is twofold. Humans in this timeline, unfortunately, and we say this with great respect, have been taken off of their original divine blueprint so far that you are attempting to reclaim it as we speak. You are all hybrids. So to say that Nefertiti and Akhenaten were different than you would also not be true, because you are all seated in the likeness of many intergalactic races. It is just that in ancient civilizations, they knew this. They understood the dynamics of the DNA and how to work with it and bring it into its most resilient and blossomed light. And these practices have been lost. So, what has happened, unfortunately, is that humans have been relegated to working with only a small subset of what's available to them within the DNA. And this has further weakened genetically humanity as we know it. But as we say this, we do want to add it is not difficult to turn that around. In fact, so many of you have already made incredible progress in terms of activating your DNA and accentuating your energy centers and aligning with the great light that you are. So we have no fear in what we are saying that humanity would meet its demise. In other words, we are simply stating the difference that we notice between who you are today and who humans were back then.
Now, Akhenaten and Nefertiti and other members of their family, some of them are depicted in art or even in sculptures as having elongated heads, and many of them wore these very tall hats or headdresses. Did they actually have elongated heads? Were they an entirely different species? And what capabilities or skills did they, or maybe even intellect, did they possess, but with that different structure?
So you must remember that the brain is not a separate organism that functions on its own. In connection to the heart, it is an electromagnetic force field. So at the very beginning of time, when many different races, as we have spoken of, arrived on planet Earth to seed a new race, they were lending the highest and best aspects of their genetics to these races. And many of them were working with a higher mind and an electromagnetic structure far more intricate and even perhaps intense than what humans have evolved to work with today. Now, In ancient civilizations, some of the elongated skulls that you see, these are truly the manifestation of material, a physical organ replicating itself in size to the amount of energy and information that it had access to. In other words, if you are to imagine the Akashic Records being a massive vault of all that has ever been known or created. And hybrid beings, the first humans on Earth, having access to that immediately. You can imagine how the human body would have to accommodate and change to allow that energy to be integrated. So these elongated skulls, we could say, are a hybrid manifestation of the more expanded genetics that humans were created in and perhaps had access to in those various civilizations. But these humans with the elongated skulls were defaulting more to their hybrid nature, which also isn't something unique only to those timelines. Let us explain. In today's world, there are humans who are accessing the Akashic records. Some of them are becoming more sensitive to their environments, even to food and water, and choosing to not ingest them at all, crystallizing their DNA, and even looking more like extraterrestrials. You have crystal children coming to the planet that are examples also of the genetic predisposition to multiple races. These are no different than the manifestations of an enlarged skull. It's just a different interpretation in a different dimension and a different timeline than the ones that these hybrid beings were on. Some of you are defaulting more to your Pleiadian genetics at times, and some of you are choosing to explore your Arcturian genetics. Naturally, this is going to create physical changes within your structure. Even the giants that are known throughout history to have walked the earth were a material manifestation of energy and information coming to light. So the material construct of your body made of light is a manifestation of energy and information that you are existing within.
So we are not at any sort of a disadvantage compared to some of these ancient beings with the elongated skulls. We're just experiencing things a little bit differently.
You are never at a disadvantage. There are certainly forces that are always going to be challenging you to awaken to things that have been stolen from you. And we think this is the case right now, as it has been the case in many other time periods and civilizations. But in a moment's notice, all of that can change. The struggle, however, that you're facing as a collective is that you as an individual can achieve so much, but that individuality is still connected to a matrix of collective energy. And the collective tide must somewhat move together. So what you're witnessing is the push and pull and the forward back motion of awakening and resistance and awakening and resistance. But just like the pull of a rubber band when it gets too far will snap in one direction, we believe this will also happen on planet Earth. And what you will find eventually is the evolution of humanity will take on a completely different look and feel and characteristic in this dimension and timeline than it has in any other.
Are there still physical beings walking the earth today who are from that ancestry who have the elongated skulls?
Yes, there must be, and there always are. Just as there are human beings walking the lineage and ancestry of Sirius, for example. But we know it's difficult to maintain, not physically, but genetically, the connection to the Akashic field that those in ancient times had. So what we're referring to here is that perhaps the elongated skull is not exactly the sign in this timeline of what it was back then. It's simply a genetic predisposition that's playing out in physical.
So would an individual who has a larger physical structure, say taller or just bigger build, have more information and energy in the body than somebody who is a smaller structure?
Yes, but that does not necessarily mean they are making use of it. So, height in and of itself is not an indication of consciousness and access to energy. It can be in a material dimension, um, um, an example of how energy wants to expand. But consciousness is always the determining factor for whether or not a soul is able to utilize what it has access to. And so we see varying levels of consciousness in different souls across the board. And it matters not if that soul is shorter than someone who is taller. The consciousness will always override the material manifestation of how energy and light choose form.
Some of the giants that are written about, and even some remains that have been found in more ancient times, biblically referred to as the Nephilim, as an example. So their structure was substantially larger than the average human being today. So do they necessarily, so in theory, they would have more energy and more information in that structure, but were they utilizing it on the whole to the same potential? So, for example, were they on the whole as a civilization living more to a greater potential than we are able to in our smaller human structures today?
Not necessarily. So let's explain the Nephilim and their arrival on Earth. Because we don't necessarily see them as human, we see them more as extra dimensional. In a choice to come to a planet that is not your own, there is a transitional process that is quite miraculous that must take place. It is like moving between dimensions. Any time that you are moving from one dimension to another, you are reconstructing everything that you are and everything that you know. So there are drastic changes that are apt to take place. What you're noticing in those ancient giants, for example, is how light at a very high speed, a very high vibrational speed, became slowed and manifested into form. And certainly the large size is accommodating the amount of information and access that those beings had. But when it finally comes into being on Earth, it doesn't necessarily automatically ensure the same access is had. Because remember, these beings that travel from a long distance, they are now in a different dimension and a different time space reality, working with material and energy in a new way. So, not all of the Nephilim, for example, were capitalizing upon who they were before and how their structures were able to utilize information. Some of them were. It's very similar to what we see on the surface of the earth right now in humans. The access is amazing. The plasmic energy and light that is coming to the planet today is activating so many, but not all are taking advantage of and using these energies to their fullest benefit.
Some of the ancient Sumerian gods and goddesses, for example, were depicted as being very large in stature compared to what appeared to be more average what we know of human beings to be in size today. And these Sumerian gods were said to have possessed great wisdom, and they built very large cities and taught people different things and so on. Now, it appears that unlike the average Nephilim that we just talked about, that some of these Sumerian gods, who also were giant, as we would think of them today based on our size now, actually did do some extraordinary things and did create extraordinary societies and so on. So would you say that that they were actually utilizing that potential in that physical structure compared to some of the Nephilim we were just referring to?
The key difference here that we think is important to note is collective intent. So often we will see a hybrid race, for example, come to the earth, and through the transition, there is some division or separation, and intent goes in different directions. And because of this, there is not a strong, unified, and resonant force that is able to channel that information for the good. And in the case of the Sumerians, we see this common intent and this unified focus, where not only is it possible to channel incredible amounts of energy and bring it through a physical structure to Earth, but to use in a combined fashion the energy of all others to support an entire civilization. And that's where many of the ancient practices, for example, that were utilized to create pyramids and very ornate temples began. This collective intent is just as important as anything else that is focused upon.
In previous conversations, we've talked about some of these ancients that are depicted as giants. And even in pre-dynastic Egypt, there are similar depictions. And throughout the world, some of them are depicted carrying handbags or something at their side. Now, how was this utilized in order to, was that something that gave them the ability to access more of that potential, to be more extraordinary, and without that technology, they would not have been able to do that?
Each of these technologies were slightly different, again, in their intention and their use. And it is not to say that the metaphysical powers had to be enhanced with a technology. But again, you must remember that the earth at the time existed in a very different dimension and in a very material vibration, which those who came were not used to. These technologies, being elemental, brought the harmony of elements and crystal from their own star systems to be combined with those of Earth. And in this way, many of the hybrids that used them found balance and equilibrium between their position on planet Earth and their other former star systems. And this is a difficult concept that we want to try and simplify. But imagine this. There are groups of intergalactics that will choose to come to a planet like Earth for a specific period of time to leave behind a legacy of teachings or create civilizations, but they will return. Of course, while they are gone, the star system that they originate from is going to go through a great deal of evolution. And that evolution may be happening on a different time space trajectory than the one that they've chosen. So many of these technologies helped them to keep up to speed with the evolutionary process that was going on within their own races, even though they were focused on serving another. And this came into being in so many different ways. In other words, Sometimes it was an immediate knowing that something new was available, a technique, a technology, a modality that could be transferred to Earth and blended with something else. Or in those in between moments when an ancient Sumerian was deciding its work on planet Earth was done and it may return to its home civilization, it was being downloaded with everything it needed to keep up to speed, to find itself in the perfect location and the perfect environment to continue its own personal evolutionary process.
Okay, so I'd like to now come back to the idea of the sacred sexuality and Tantra and so on. We may not finish this conversation this time, but at least we can get started. And we'll continue in a future conversation. But before we get into the specifics, can you define what you refer to as Tantra? Because today it's different. So can you all define it, but also tell us how it's different today from what it was before?
The most simplified definition of Tantra that we can offer is the blending of masculine and feminine energies to perfect balance. Now, this has changed, of course, throughout many timelines on planet Earth, often because in sexual practice, the imbalance of masculine and feminine has been focused upon, and that imbalance continues to perpetuate today. Or in intimacy, there is no utilization of the true life force and sexual energy that two souls are able to tap into if they are attentive, fully attentive to each other.
In order for, you mentioned masculine and feminine balance is one of the fundamentals of Tantra. And so is it necessary for it to be a male and female physiology that are existing in masculine and feminine balance, or can you have two male or two female or anything like that?
As we see it today, and as we have seen it throughout history, the chemistry and the biology and the energy of the sacred masculine and feminine are the only two that are able to work this in perfection. And this is why they both work completely different sides of the equation and are offering something completely unique to the other.
What you're essentially saying then is that we in order to be in an optimal state of balance, we do have to have a male and a female physiology that are existing in that balance. Is that correct so far?
When you're speaking of balance, we know there are many who are listening to this transmission who are going to interpret that word completely differently. Because within the self, masculine and feminine balance can be found, even if there is a predisposition to one or the other. And this is how. Knowing thyself is always going to allow for the masculine or the feminine within you to find its proper balance. And this is why, even in a divine feminine soul, the mental and physical bodies can become a perfect manifestation through the feminine, and vice versa. But in tantric practice, in coupling, the idea is that the masculine and feminine energy stem from prime creator and are equal parts of the same vibration. And when they are merged, are not only going to accentuate in the other what is out of balance, but allow them to use their predisposed area of focus to an even higher and more conscious ability.
And so, in one of the differences that exists today, then, would you say, is that we've taken this sacred sexuality more into a physical sexuality, where today we have lost touch with the spiritual component, but it's become highly physicalized. Even Tantra, as we know of today, is a very physical practice and not as spiritual.
And perhaps we would use the word energetic as opposed to spiritual, because it has become physicalized, but also very focused on momentary satisfaction and generating creative energy in the lower chakras. And while the lower chakras are extremely important, as that energy becomes channeled into the higher, a more spiritually and enlightened soul emerges. So using tantric practice is not even sometimes a necessary focus on sexuality at all. It is building the natural life force energy from the lower chakras into the higher, time and time again, to be sent and spilled over into the vibration of another. But remember also what we have stated about the heart and the resonance of the heart, because in ancient tantric practice, the resonance of the heart between the masculine and feminine soul became one. And in that grew a field. And that field was not only beneficial for the manifestation of what those souls were meant to do and able to create on planet Earth, but could spill over into the anointing and manifestation of others. And this is why these individuals were seen as rulers or leaders or mentors. It had less to do with their position of power or decisions they were making, and more to do with the energy field that they were collectively building on behalf of their civilizations.
Then, in that case, the heart connection is absolutely essential to practicing tantra in the ideal sense, right? So if somebody's in a couple or a couple situation where there isn't love or harmony in the relationship, tantra be would not work in that situation, would it?
If a couple is not in a state of love or highest respect for another, Tantra or the energy of life force cannot be properly raised. And here is why. Love has no limits when it is expressed within. And someone who has deep love and respect for themselves would not enter into intimate relationship with another just for the feeling of pleasure. And this is something that everyone should consider and perhaps even teach to the younger generations, because the genetic fluids that are exchanged during intimate acts are changing the dynamics of your entire structure. And what you are aiming for is to ensure that you not only become more resilient and prosperous and strong, but that the energy you're cultivating is going to be shared in a beneficial way with others. And that is truly what the origins of intimate relationship is. It is thought to be for the self and for the other, but the partnership goes well beyond that. The relationship between intimate partners is changing the entire planet, or can change, we should say, the entire planet for the better.
In more ancient times, didn't some divine feminine masters play a role as a sexual activator or in tantric practice for individuals who they were not in a loving relationship with?
They were not necessarily in a state of servitude in this way. And it certainly depends on the civilization that you are referring to, because there are many. But the most revered, the ones that were in the highest intention, for example, knew the value of divine feminine energy, because the masculine rulers at the time who would choose, for example, a harem of female beings. We're not doing so to show any neglect for their well-being, nor to show any semblance of hierarchy or power. They were receiving something very valuable to be shared with others. It was cultivating a powerful energy that the masculine did not have access to alone. And in some civilizations, this was needed in abundance because there were a great many goals to achieve. And certainly there were challenges that were faced. So the feminine was revered for the reinstatement and we'll say restoration of life force energy necessary in those guiding entire communities. Keep in mind, however, this was not done only in a physical, sexual way. And unfortunately, many of the stories of these historical times have been changed to slight them in a sense. Most of these practices were done in a meditative stance, collectively and individually, one-on-one. The feminine harems were taken extremely well care of because in pampering them, their vibration would culminate and grow and have an immediate effect on all of those surrounding them.
Yeah, King Solomon is said to have had 1,000 wives. So you're saying that it wasn't a sexual, physical relationship he was having with them. They served as a vessel for energetic contribution to help him to fulfill all of the things that he did in that lifetime.
It is not to say that the Tantra that was practiced at that time did not lean into any type of physical contact. But we don't see this as the premise nor the overarching theme of these relationships that he had with these women. Many of them were revered oracles who were bringing energies and insights in from the greater universe. Others were offering restorative breath practice and together time traveling throughout the cosmos to bring back information as well as modalities and various insights that could be capitalized on and used in the civilization that he was focused upon. There are a variety of stories and scenarios. Tantra is never one thing, and we think this is what has been taken out of context in this timeline in how Tantra is practiced. While certainly there are ancient instructional practices that can be followed, the best tantric practice is cultivated personally between one and another because every individual is completely different. The key, however, and the foundation is ensuring a rhythmic and succession of breath. The in and the out breath, finding its oneness between the individuals practicing so that everyone is lifting each other up into a higher vibration and dimension.
What role do the male and female play in a tantric practice that's unique to each of them? Let's start with female, for example. What is their role in that interaction?
The divine feminine is nourishing and replenishing the chi of the masculine because, as a physical and mentally focused soul, that energy is being utilized very rapidly and is not just lost in sexual practice, which unfortunately has become the norm in the timeline that you are in. It is utilized in very practical ways. And so the feminine is nourishing and replenishing that masculine energy by offering her own, because there is a wellspring of access that the feminine has through spirit to the we'll say plasmic universe. Many speak of the cosmic womb or the womb of all creation. We simply see this as a force field a field that is universal, that all have access to. But again, the lineage of divine feminine beings throughout history, they have practiced this. And because of the way their structure is oriented, having a womb themselves, sitting right in the area where life force is generated, are more powerful in their ability to share it. So the masculine and feminine relationship is extremely important in this way, as the feminine is nourishing the masculine, and the masculine is perhaps helping the feminine to achieve even greater bandwidths of energy. It is less to do with a restorative type of transaction, as it is a more relaxing and softening type of energy. When the feminine is in the arms of the masculine, it does not have to uphold anything that it is not. And in doing so, is available to receive all that it is. So we see beneficial transmissions or channelings and offerings going in both directions.
Does the masculine typically lose energy or vitality or life force in a tantric practice? But you're saying if the practice is done correctly in a heart-centered way, the female replenishes that.
Yes, that is correct. Even if there is a physical release of that elixir, the divine feminine in a tantric practice will restore the bounty to the masculine. And there is a never ending supply of life force that the masculine is able to tap into.
Now, in modern times, in the wedding tradition, there's the honeymoon. And honeymoon is a combination of honey and moon. From my understanding, there appears to be some ancient traditions around the use of honey and honeycomb and the idea of the moon or the lunar cycles. What is that connection? What's the significance of honey or honeycomb in the tantric practice?
Well, the most important, we believe, while there are many, is that the honeycomb represents the frequencies of the heart blending together in two individuals and becoming a massive force field in and of itself. It is a geometry no less important than any other. In fact, those that were blessed with the honeycomb were taking in a sacred and physical divination tool to help them better merge their heart centers as one. But we also think about the connection of the hive and how the hive operates. There is a queen, and that queen is supporting all of the bees in doing everything that they must to ensure their sustenance and prosperity. And perhaps this is the greatest analogy for how we see the masculine and feminine interacting. Well, we don't want to put the feminine above the masculine by any means. It was well known in these ancient civilizations that the feminine was the catalyst of this energy in the masculine, and could provide not only for her beloved, but also for entire civilizations, this unified connection.
How can the honeycomb or honey be used in a tantric practice to enhance that connection or to enhance the potential?
It is symbolic, yet imagine within the honey itself, there is a similar type of elixir and life force capability. And this is why many today are still using honey as a medicinal type of remedy, because within it is the vibration of all those who created it. And that vibration is very high. So if we are using this as a tool to enter our tantric practice, perhaps what we are doing is setting the vibrational tone and intention of what we want to achieve.
Are lunar cycles or any astrological cycles necessary to observe in tantric practice?
Not necessary, but sometimes beneficial. And there are so many, it would be difficult for us to name them. But the ancients revered the lunar cycles because they knew it was not only a passage and a purging of energies not necessary to continue on with them in the next phase, but it was an intensified time where the divine feminine was at her peak. In other words, if we are looking at the access to emotion or the access to spirit, the divine feminine is using the lunar cycle within her own body to cleanse and to purify. So these times were noticed and certainly revered for these practices.
Now, in some ancient books, such as the Kama Sutra or even modern Tantra books, they use different kinds of physical positions or things like that. Is that part of that practice in ancient times? Is it even necessary to have that physical, those physical positions that they use in these books or these reference materials? Or can Tantra be achieved simply by meditating side by side or in some non-physical way?
Tantra, in our minds, it is a meditative practice. It is the synchronizing of breath and the two becoming one, however that best happens between both partners. What you're seeing in some of these instruction manuals having to do with physical position are certain preferences for moving the body in order to heighten the access of life force. It's somewhat like yogic practices. Certain poses are positioning the body to channel energy or to receive it in a heightened sense. Yet we don't think that yogic practice is for everyone. In the same way, we don't believe that these tantric poses are meant for everyone either. There are so many different options that you can choose in intimacy. As a matter of fact, we think it's important to become open to exploring these various ways of being in intimate relationship, to truly find what piques not only your physical and sexual pleasure, but your vibration. That is what's most important. That blissful orgasmic state is not something that should be taken lightly, nor happen in a moment's notice. It is something that can be cultivated throughout your entire life. And this is perhaps what makes the poses less important than the breath, because these may assist in reaching that high vibrational blissful state in a physical way, but isn't supporting a couple or even an individual in carrying that orgasmic state beyond the experience.
So in that case, just simply the alternating breath between a male and female is all that's necessary to enter this tantric state or to have a tantric practice. The physical is an optional enhancement, but not required.
It does simplify the practice a bit, but yes, we agree that the rhythmic breath is the perfect place to start. But the energy has to be cultivated. Remember, this is what we are most concerned about. And cultivating energy, it can happen within individuals and couples in so many different ways. For example, raising the energy from the lower chakras to the higher is something that in ancient practice was a part of these meditative periods, where teachers would guide those who were stepping into an intimate or committed relationship beyond the sexual component to raise Kundalini. Kundalini raised within each individual can intertwine and can exemplify the response that you are having internally. This can not only be used as a creative tool in terms of manifestation and focus of intent, but it can also be very healing to the physical body in all regards. Whether there is some disease in the body, in the mind, in the emotional body, this Kundalini energy we speak of, the rising of that elixir from the base of the spine all the way up to the crown and through the root is like a magical serum. It is not just meant to enlighten and raise consciousness, giving humans full access to the pineal gland and all that is available there, but also helping the body to function better as a holistic vehicle. And this is truly what the focus and intention was in these civilizations. It was not just the prosperity and the abundance of the couple and the civilization, but ensuring that they would live as long as possible in the most heightened way, comfortable way that they could, to be the best versions of themselves.
Does Tantra practice extend lifespan then for the couple?
It is practiced in that way and for that intent, yes.
In ancient times, at least in some biblical stories and other stories as well, it's said that some of these ancients lived for hundreds or thousands of years. Was that because of their physiology or the dimension being different then, or was it a tantric practice?
Well, it is a combination of both because there are many factors that must be considered. Primarily, those in ancient civilizations were not dealing with the toxic environment that many of you are today. So they were predisposed to living longer because there was nothing influencing their bodies away from an organic state of life. In addition to this, we might say their belief systems were completely different than the ones that you have adopted now. And these are genetic as well, handed down through lineages. We expect to die at a certain age, and because that expectation is there, it is wired around the possibility of our leaving the planet. But the way Tantra works right now in this day and age is that it bypasses those limiting beliefs because as the Kundalini rises naturally and works its way into the higher centers, the pineal, the mind, the crown, you are becoming more not only aware of options that you have at your disposal, either physically or spiritually, to elongate your life, or you're questioning what has been taught to you before about any limitation that you may have in that way. So it's somewhat like breaking all of the physical and spiritual norms in one practice.
What you're describing about Tantra and raising energy in this couple situation, you're not referring to what seems to be very prevalent in tantric teachings and practice today, which is raising sexual energy to feel that sexual arousal. So you're not referring to a sexual arousal type of energy. You're referring to more of like a bliss state, kundalini, which would not be sexual.
Well, they seem to be one and the same. It is just that you are putting a distinction between the two. So, sexual energy to us is a spiritual energy, but it has been corrupted in this timeline through religious dogma, for example, and a variety of other things. Um, in its purest state, when you are raising sexual energy, you are activating life force. That is your creative source moving from deep within you. The problem is it becomes wasted when the intention is simple pleasure. And there's nothing wrong with pleasure. We as Pleiadians, in fact, enjoy spending time together and pleasuring each other. We think this is a very important part of our everyday life. But it is the intent behind that pleasure that is missing. And so for us, when we are in the pursuit of pleasure, we know that that pleasure is going to extend outward to our entire star system because it is ultimately a frequency that is going to signal others and be shared widely beyond ourselves, if that makes sense.
Yes. So what becomes available to a couple that practices tantra that they would not otherwise have available?
Well, it certainly depends upon the individuals. So it would be difficult for us to put this in a very rigid definition. However, we'll give you some examples of what we believe can be accomplished and what was accomplished in ancient civilizations. It is the willingness of both parties to be open to what they are able to achieve and receive from each other. First of all, we notice that couples become far more telepathic when they are practicing Tantra. And what that means is they're not using that telepathy against each other, but there's a synergistic type of way of moving together in relationship and on the earth to accentuate the divine plans of both parties. And it is somewhat like a beneficial give and take where there is no need to feel slighted or to argue about what is given or what is received. The couple begins to focus more as one and to think more as one, using their individualized gifts and talents where necessary to accentuate each other. And this is why Tantra was so revered amongst leaders, for example, in ancient civilizations like Egypt, because to truly thrive as a community, very complex plans and the orchestration of energy was necessary. And these couples, in merging their energy, were working as one in the most beneficial way possible. Now, in the physical, many, many changes can happen. Certainly, we could go into a great amount of detail on spiritual activation. And we do notice that partners are coming together in mass lately to spiritually activate each other in a tantric or sexual way. Some refer to this as a spiritual sexuality, where it is not just a physical experience, but couples are walking away, having very deep insights, channeled encounters, for example, even seeing energy differently simply because they have been together. And nonetheless revealing the mysteries of their past lives that they have spent together in many different incarnations. But most beneficial, we believe, is the self-generating and rejuvenating force of the masculine feminine in tantric balance. There are energies, as we have spoken of from the beginning of this transmission, that the masculine and feminine are both slighted to. And in giving those to each other, there is a unified force within the body itself. The body remembers. It is a holistic vehicle. Cells are no longer acting out on their own and naming themselves as something other than the entity and the body that the soul has claimed. We see organs and systems working more in harmony. We see the nervous system coming into perfect balance. And we see souls who have been suffering or struggling a great deal with physical life rising above some of the complications of their karmic lessons and easily navigating these far better than what they would have alone. So there are so many benefits we could continue to discuss, but we think these are the most important of note.
Well, we're almost out of time, but I have one more question before we finish. Are there any other changes that we can make in our physical lives for male and female that would help to enhance or at least cultivate us moving toward a more optimal state of divine masculine or feminine, depending on which sex we happen to be?
Regardless of your status with a current loving partner, there are two areas of focus that we believe are most beneficial. We've spoken first of the Kundalini. And the Kundalini rising is something we always recommend. And we know it is made to be very complicated in its process. when in fact it is simply a focus on the breath, rising the energy from the lower chakras into the higher. If this was practiced every day, those that are divine masculine, those that are divine feminine would be working with the energies of preference in the most sound and harmonized ways. In fact, their bodies would respond even better to the orientation of their biology and the chemistry that is meant to follow them throughout their lifetimes. In addition to this, we mentioned the resonance of heart. And heart resonance is something that is very difficult to both find and hold on to in this timeline. It is simply because the earth is changing so radically and there's so much going on in each individual's personal timeline. Yet to spend a few moments a day focused on the resonance of the heart, bringing the breath into this space, expanding the chest and allowing the energy to enter is another recommendation. We know this sounds like a very simplified practice, but to us, it is everything. Because the more your heart falls into resonance with your own personal truth, the more the truth of others becomes honored. And you will find yourself very quickly within a unified collective.
Well, I have one more question since you brought it up. So these days, there are a lot of people on the planet who are either alone or in relationships that are not heart-centered or loving. So how does somebody in those situations, if Tantra can bring so much of more of an enhanced life, if they don't have access to that right now, then where do they go? Or is there some practice or way of being they can adopt that would draw in a relationship that would provide for that kind of interaction?
Well, for Tantra to take place between a couple, it must be self generated first. So, to practice the self generation of Tantra, the rise of the Kundalini on your own is a beneficial practice, we believe. It may draw in a partner simply because expanding your energy field is going to expand your options. Right now, regardless of who you are and whether or not you have a partner, there are multiple potentials that already exist for the right partner to enter at the perfect time. And while the time may not be now, you want to cultivate the perfect energy for the arrival of that partner. And this is a rejuvenating force that you can personally benefit from as well. So any simple breath practice done alone, we believe can be just as beneficial as one done with a partner. Because remember, as a creative entity and energy, the masculine and feminine is present within all.
Thank you. Well, that's it for today. We went a little bit longer than I'd planned, but thank you all for joining us for another show, and we'll be back again soon with another episode, and we'll continue our conversations where we left off and go into some other interesting topic areas as well.